Thank you all for coming out tonight for this special event. We are delighted to have Kathy Kelly here. And by we, the two groups that are co-sponsoring this event tonight are the First United Methodist Church here in Boulder and the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. And I'm Ron Forthover with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. So trying to get things rolling along. You're in for a special treat because you have one of the most outstanding peace activists in the world here tonight. So I won't say much more because Dan Winters will do the introduction in a moment. We'd like to find out about people who attend these events. And how did you hear about this event? Was it email?
Yes.
Yes. Radio?
Yes.
Email. Email?
And
Newspaper?
radio.
Which paper?
Hold it, the camera.
The other camera? All right.
Yeah, that was me too. I saw it in the paper this morning.
Okay. Any other sources?
DJ, could you raise the mic, please? It's not picking you up.
I don't need to be heard. The speakers need to be heard. So, I also have some sign-up sheets for the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. If you'd like to get our emails about events that are going on in the community, just feel free to put your name and email, contact information here. So if you can just pass these around. Yeah, I have a special affinity for Kathy because she was one of the ones who was involved in my education in nonviolence activities. So it's nice to see one of my mentors here again. Dan Winters from the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center will do the formal introduction of Kathy. Dan?
Well, I don't know how formal it'll be, but many of you, of course, know about Kathy Kelly and that she's been nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize. But for those of you who don't know, just let me say that she's been an activist, very much of an activist for decades and decades. Well, maybe not that many. It's a long time, going back to her Catholic worker days. And we possibly know her from the Voices in the Wilderness, where she organized between 1996 and 2003 something like 70 delegations to Iraq, bringing the medicine, food, dignitaries trying to break those sanctions that were imposed on the people of Iraq. She's also been in situations of warfare, supporting people by witnessing with her personal beliefs, with her body, in places such as Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Bosnia. And so it's really a pleasure and great treat to have her here. I consider her a friend. And tonight's talk is, where is it now? Oh, Seeing Through the Smoke Screen, War and Peace in Afghanistan. And I'm sure, as she's mentioned, that during the question period, you can ask much more or other areas besides the war in Afghanistan, such as on different situations, and she's been very much involved in anti-drone work. So a lot of us have become interested in that area. So without any further ado, as they say, Kathy Kelly.
Well, good evening. It's a great privilege to be here. I just want to double check and make sure I can be heard in the back. Yes. Okay. I'm happy to be in the mountains. You know, Chicago is flat as a pancake, so just being in your wonderful terrain has been great. And thank you for the hospitality. I look forward to that, having been here in Boulder before, and also it's great to, again, admire the work of the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center and all the fine activists here. So thank you very much. Chicago is certainly flat, but when I was a child, we would get excited about planes that were taking off from Midway Airport. We'd never seen all these planes in the sky, and so we'd ride our bikes as far as we could and count the planes going overhead. And of course, never ever would we have imagined that one of those planes would bomb us. It was a very secure childhood. I thought of that recently. I was on the back porch of our apartment in Chicago, and I had recently returned from Gaza, and I remember thinking, oh, I'm hearing a plane go overhead, and I'm not raising my shoulders, waiting to hear an explosion. So I want to start with some lines from a book that was written by a novelist about Korea, actually. Jane Ann Phillips wrote a book called Lark and Termite. And in it she describes a Korean war setting wherein a U.S. soldier is so war-weary, he's lonesome for the love of his life, he wants to go home. And at one point, while he's listening to and watching the planes go overhead, he says, "The planes always come, like planets on rotation, a timed bloodletting with different excuses." I'll just say that again. The planes always come, like planets on rotation, a timed bloodletting with different excuses. And so now we have the latest generations of planes fulfilling the goals of 21st century militarism. The drones, the planes without pilots, the introduction probably to another new generation of planes, while scientists prostitute themselves to the militarism. And we can anticipate that there will be autonomous robotics in the future. And the line that Jane Ann Phillips used, I believe, still obtains. There are no excuses. Different excuses are given every time. And we're somehow lulled into thinking that the United States, with its exceptionalism, is somehow excusable and we can market our wars. And so I'd just like to ask you to remember with me back to way back when, in 1991. Probably the most courageous thing I did at that time was get on the Archer Avenue bus and go home to tell my mother I was about to peel off and go to Iraq. Dan Winters and I were part of a group that was called the Gulf Peace Team. And I had just finished doing a year in prison, actually, and so my mother thought I'd done quite enough for the peace movement for 1 year. And how was she ever going to explain to the neighbors that now daughter number 3 was heading off to a war zone to stand in between the warring parties? And so I was trying to explain to my mom, if the United States was really so upset about a dictator, we wouldn't have supported so many in Central and South America. Or if we didn't like invasions, we just invaded Grenada and Panama. And I realized I was getting nowhere. I was digging myself in deeper. So I just gave my mother a kind of wooden hug goodbye, and then I turned, and any of you who lived in Chicago in the winter, I got a blast of Chicago cold air in my face, and my mother's Irish accent at my back. "What about the incubators? Kathy, what about the incubators?" Well, she kind of had me. Some of you might remember that in advance of that 1991 war, in August, after Saddam Hussein's soldiers had invaded Kuwait, a beautiful Kuwaiti teenager, Nayira, testified in front of a Senate investigating committee that she had witnessed Iraqi soldiers burst into the hospital where she worked, pull incubators out of the wall, dump the babies out, presumably to die, and they looted the incubators. And her testimony was picked up by C-SPAN. President George Bush Sr. quoted it in his State of the Union message, and hands kind of went up all across the United States in agreement with my mother. You've got to do something about people like that. They ought to be stopped. Well, my mother's question was certainly relevant after the terrible bombing that destroyed every single electrical facility all across Iraq, because all of those incubators in other hospitals all across Iraq were on the fritz. There wasn't any electricity. Then they couldn't get spare parts. Then the children who were starving began to die because starvation plus respiratory diseases plus gastroenteritis couldn't be survived, and hundreds and then thousands and then hundreds of thousands of children died. And there weren't incubators. But 6 months after the ceasefire had been declared, 2 very enterprising journalists, one from the New York Times, the other from TV Guide, what can I say, teamed up, and they went over to Kuwait because it was interesting to them to find out more from the doctors in that Kuwaiti hospital from that day when the Iraqi soldiers had burst in and stolen the incubators. And the Kuwaiti doctors began to ask, incubators? Do you want to buy incubators? You want to sell? What about? And the New York Times journalist figured out something's fishy with this story and began to dig. And it turned out Nayira had never left the United States. She was the daughter of a Kuwaiti diplomat working in Washington, D.C., and the Kuwaiti embassy had hired the Hill and Knowlton public relations firm to coach the Kuwaitis to help market the 1991 war, the Desert Storm. It seems that if the United States think tanks and public relations experts can market a war to the United States public, then it won't be held against them, if you will, that even though the wars are generally designed to pillage other people's resources, to geopolitically situate the United States, to have more control and to control the pricing and flow of resources, nevertheless, if you can get people to believe, and it's an oxymoron, I almost can't say that what they're looking at is a humanitarian war, then you'll at least get indifference on the part of the United States public. And so many people thought, well, at least we got rid of Saddam Hussein for the Iraqis, and oughtn't they be grateful? And imagine Iraq today. And with regard to Afghanistan, I still hear people saying, well, you know, we don't want war to continue. We don't like the idea of United States troops in Afghanistan, but we don't want to abandon the women and children to the Taliban. So I'd like to talk with you a little bit more about experiences in Afghanistan with women and children and others who have been so generous in giving us hospitality. I mentioned the mountains, and actually being from a very flat place, I don't always do so well at higher altitudes. But the young Afghan peace volunteers who welcome me are like little social workers. They have realized that the widows and the orphans get literally pushed up the mountainside. And in the very, very cold winters, where 100 people froze to death in Afghanistan, in Kabul alone, in the winter of January 2012, widows who don't have any money for rent go up higher because there's no water higher up on the mountain, and so the rents tend to be less. And so the young ones go up the mountainside to go and visit and find out who is most in need. And they have a project along with some very indigent seamstresses to make the very heavy blankets that can make the difference between life and death really during the cold winters when infants have frozen to death as well. So I went with them, and I started to faint, and they kind of had to haul me into the home of Harab toward the top of the mountain. And there I was immediately revived by a kindly woman. She gave me green tea. And I noticed throughout a conversation she was constantly shelling almonds. And she was using those almond shells for fuel. She put the shells in a small, tiny oven called a bukhari. And then she'd save all of the almond meats because she'd send her son back down the mountain. And that's how they'd get some kind of income, selling the almond meats. And otherwise, they had no real source of income. And Harab herself would have to go down the mountain early in the morning in the cold and fetch water, and then with a heavy water container on her head or on her shoulders, come all the way back up the mountain. And of course, they were more fortunate than so many others in Afghanistan, where every single day, according to Amnesty International, the war displaces 400 people. 400 people every day running from the violence, running from bombs, running from attacks, running from night raids, running from fear that maybe if a drone attacked the area the previous day, the Taliban might come the next day and accuse them of having given information to the Taliban. So people on the run, they go to already overcrowded cities. There's no room. There's no infrastructure to speak of. Even where I live, when I stay with the Afghan Peace Volunteers, we get electricity every other day. And when the pipes freeze, there's no water. But the people I'm thinking of are the ones who live really in the rough, in the refugee camps. And in these camps, the life is so very, very difficult, especially because there's no work for the men. What can they do? There's unemployment at very high rates already in a city like Kabul, and maybe in the nicer weather they might get jobs as porters and haul and lug heavy equipment for construction sites, but there's not even so much construction anymore, and they don't want to do it, but they send the children out to work. 600,000 child laborers in Afghanistan, 60,000 of them living in Kabul. Last winter, a little one named Safar came to our door, and he was convulsive. He was shivering so badly. And he was wearing a plaid kind of flannel shirt and thin pants, no socks, no gloves, and he's a shoe-shine boy. And to thaw out his fingers, he had just gone to a barbecue outdoors and had just wanted to warm his hands over the barbecue pit. Well, the shopkeeper thought maybe he wanted to steal something and picked up a hot skewer and thwapped him right across the face. So Safar had a very bright red welt on his face when he came to us. And so he calmed down a little bit, and we began to ask him, would he want to be part of a program that the Afghan Peace Volunteers are doing to kind of help street vendors and shoeshine boys retire. They can come to the Afghan Peace Volunteers and get warm clothing and some school supplies and some remedial help, and then we make sure that their families get a big sack of rice and a big can of oil to make up for what they would have otherwise earned. So that was a good thing for Safar, but so many other children, so many parents have an extraordinarily difficult time. And meanwhile, the United States is still peddling the notion that the United States has been over there helping alleviate the suffering of women and children. Right now, 1 million children in Afghanistan are suffering from severe acute malnourishment. If they recover, it's highly likely that they'll also have what's called iodine deficiency disorder, and this causes brain damage. Well, the good news would be that in order to help a child get adequate iodized salt into their diet, the cost over the course of a year to provide that salt for a child would be 5 cents per child per year. Now, if you don't mind imagining Lady Justice and the scales, the cost to keep one U.S. soldier in Afghanistan for 1 year, this year, is $2.1 million. $2.1 million to keep one soldier there for 1 year, and 5 cents to get salt into the diet of a child for 1 year. And I think if most U.S. people were given that choice, they would unquestionably go for the salt, go for the child, go for life. And how in the world, people would ask, is it costing $2.1 million? Are the soldiers having filet mignon and lobster? Well, of course, that's not the case. But you see, well, let me just offer this statistic as well, because I think it's helpful. The cost for 1 gallon of gasoline in an airborne or a landborne vehicle in Afghanistan in 2012 was $800 per gallon. How can this be? Anatole Levin in the New York Review of Books helps us figure this out. You see, when supplies are delivered for every United States base, whether it was a forward operating base or one of the huge bases or an airfield or a prison or military contractors, those supplies were delivered by truck. The trucks would arrive in the southern coast of Pakistan, the port of Gwadar, the port of Karachi, and then the trucks would be driven across Pakistan along roads that most often were controlled by warlords, very often Taliban warlords. And then either at Quetta or the Khyber Pass, they cross into Afghanistan, and another set of warlords is in charge of those roads, often Taliban, sometimes perhaps drug lords and warlords. So they all charge for every truck, every day, a tax. And so Anatole Levin says in the New York Review of Books that since the 2001 war began in Afghanistan, the United States has been subsidizing the Taliban by paying all of these taxes so that the Taliban won't torch the trucks. And actually, what could be a better deal for the Taliban? They don't have to do anything, just collect the money. And meanwhile, people in the United States think that the United States is protecting the women and the children from the Taliban. Do you know the Special Inspector General of Afghanistan report, which is issued quarterly, in December of 2013, reported that the non-military spending in Afghanistan is now approaching billion. Of that huge sum, 3 billion is all that was ever spent on humanitarian concerns. Now 3 billion is a lot, but when you divide the 3 billion by 30 million people in Afghanistan over 10 years, maybe the 3 billion isn't such a huge sum, but whatever in the world happened to the other 97 billion if you've got a country which has a wrecked infrastructure, inadequate health care delivery, corrupt governance, and is now exporting 93% of the world's opium, by the way? Well, the chart for the CIGAR report says that the money was spent on counter-narcotics. It didn't work very well, did it? That the money was spent on governance. But the government of Afghanistan, according to Transparency International, is the most corrupt government in the world. That the money was spent on oversight, and well, maybe the drones were helping with that oversight, but don't you think that maybe those unmanned aerial vehicles flying 24/7, collecting miles and miles of footage, might have noticed that there are convoys of opium all day long being carried out of Afghanistan, and convoys paying taxes to warlords going through the roadways of Afghanistan, but we never ever hear a word about that. Instead, I think we have been lulled more and more into somehow feeling a kind of an uneasy indifference. Well, I just don't know enough about that war, and maybe the troops are helping the people in Afghanistan. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm very much a city person. It's not so easy for me, really, to understand what's happening amongst people in Afghanistan. When I was growing up, after you went to high school, you went to college. It was kind of taken for granted, really. So it takes an extra stretch for me to imagine how proud a family, an Afghan rural family, would be, such as the Namati family, when their children go on to university, especially in a place where the education system is so corrupt that they say a lot of the seats at the university are basically sold before anybody even takes the entrance test. So the Namati family's youngsters, Ismail Namati and Burnullah Namati, were a great source of pride for the whole village, really, because they'd placed into the Kabul Polytechnic University and the University of Kabul. And on the first night of Ramadan, of course, they're going to come to get together with their family for the feast that night. But when they got to the family compound and knocked on the door, it seems that they might have also appeared on the screen of people in Creech Air Force Base or another United States base whose job was to monitor who were walking along the roads of the Maidan Wardak province and knocking on basically any family doors in an area where they were pretty sure the Taliban had previously visited. And in fact, the Taliban had visited the Namati family the night before. And then when the Taliban knock on the door, since time immemorial, if people ask you for food, you don't say, well, 7-Eleven is that way and Motel 6 is over there. You generally share according to the customary code, and maybe the Taliban would return if the family chose not to share with them. So the Taliban were given something to eat and they were long gone. And then the two boys come home, possibly mistaken for Taliban. This occasions a discussion in the U.S. military that then decides that at 2 o'clock in the morning, the U.S. Army vehicles pull up and a night raid is staged. The youngest child, Wahidullah, said that he thought the soldiers in the middle of the night were trying to wake his brother Ismail up, and he heard his brother Ismail trying to say to them, we are students, we are students. And next thing he knew, he heard shots. And the neighbors said there were 3 pools of blood.
Oh my God.
And at the other end of the compound, another brother had a bag over his head that was placed by an Afghan interrogator, and the interrogator was walloping the brother on one side of the head and then on the other and screaming at him, tell me where the guns are. Say where the guns are. And the third brother, Faribullah, said, believe me, if you find any guns, come and shoot me with them. There are no guns. And the next day, the United States military issued an apology. We're sorry. We're so very sorry. And the villagers were up in arms. They were so very furious. And I wish I could say, well, this story is an exception. But it's truthfully not. We've assigned ourselves at Voices a kind of macabre task of keeping a record of every time that we learn of Afghan civilians being killed by international security assistance forces. And it's scandalous to me that so often the first response from the U.S. military is denial. But it turns out if you stay with the story, there often is an eventual acknowledgement. One of the most dramatic. And again, if I look to my own experience, it's hard for me to understand this, but typically for an Afghan woman in the rural areas, you are allowed by your father and your brothers and your uncles to leave the village once a year. Can you imagine? Once a year. Well, then also imagine the excitement in the Daikhondi province when the elders had decided that a 3-car convoy, 2 SUVs and a pickup truck, would take grandmothers, women, children, infants, shopkeepers, some students who needed to return to school, squeeze them all into the cars, every single space was used, and at dawn they set forth to go first to Kandahar to do marketing, and then some would go on to Kabul for medical care. Must have been tremendously exciting, huh? So the convoy is winding its way along a mountain road. Who knew? 3.5 miles away, United States paratroopers were dropped out of an airborne vehicle to do a light reconnaissance mission. Of course, to protect the paratroopers, drone operators at Creech Air Force Base were keeping an eye on the terrain, and they spotted the 3-car convoy. And so immediately there begins, and all of this is recorded in the Los Angeles Times, February 11th, 2012, by an author named David Cloud. The operators, which were inclusive of screeners and the kill team in Oskaloosa, Florida, that was brought in to try to help decide, do we or don't we attack this convoy, began to just, several of them, feel certain. There can't be any question. This is a Taliban convoy. They saw the convoy stop, and many men got out and knelt down, and their foreheads touched the ground, and they started to pray. And one of the drone operators said, well, that's a sure sign of something nefarious. And then they were arguing, I think I see a gun. Well, it could be a stick. Looks like a gun to me. And another said, well, I think I'm seeing a child. And the one who thought he saw the gun said, well, how come you can say that's a child and I can't say that's a gun? And this argument goes on. It's kind of tortuous when you're reading it in retrospect, especially because they finally arrived at the decision, we have to attack the convoy. And so the first car explodes. And a helicopter was called in. The drone was weaponized, but they didn't have enough weapons on the drone to fully destroy the convoy. So a helicopter was called in, and it destroyed the 3rd car. And then, according to the report I read, civilians who had survived from the 2nd car were trying to wave their colored clothing. Can you imagine the women trying to wave their scarves so that it would be known that they were survivors? And then the word came out through the survivors that there were no Taliban, there were no fighters in any of those cars, and an apology was issued. The stories go on and on. Parents who went running to a mountainside when they heard explosions, and their children had been out collecting fuel, as children do. The youngsters I know, when they're with their families, actually will go 6 hours walking with their donkeys out to try to find what looks more like tumbleweed almost, and they'll stuff their burlap sacks with that and then walk 6 hours back, and imagine how fast that fuel burns. So it's typical for people to go out in search of fuel and to go out in the early morning hours so they can bring the fuel back and have hot water for breakfast. And it's not so easy when it's murky outside to distinguish your who is who. The parents heard the explosions and they went and they found dismembered, bloodied bodies of their children, 9 youngsters who had been killed. And there was one surviving youngster because a tree. First, he'd seen 2 combat brigade unit helicopters go up the side of the mountain. And these are so huge that they used the same engine, that you'd use in an Abrams tank. Imagine how much fuel. And the second one gave out a bright green flash, and then there protruded a gun, and it immediately started to kill all of the children on the mountainside, except Wahidullah, who was covered with leaves. And General Petraeus the next day issued an apology. He said this tragic event should never have happened. And of course that was true, but on the tragic events go. Do you know, I was recently asked by a professor at the University of Wisconsin Whitewater campus if I wouldn't address the question of whether or not I felt that the depleted resources in our world today were leading toward a shrinking humanism, and that shrinking humanism is reflected in some of the dystopian novels and films that we see quite often these days. And I wasn't sure what to say, so I turned to Buddy Bell, with whom I work, and he's a very bright young man in his 30s, and he said, hang on. And he went back to his room and came back with a CD put out by Utah Phillips. It's about 20 years old. And he said, listen to track 3. And as I listened to it, it was Utah Phillips telling a story from a time when he himself was a soldier in Korea. And Utah Phillips was covered with mold and vermin. His boots had rotted. He smelled horribly. And he just wanted to jump in the Incheon River and swim and clean up. But it was not allowed. And he couldn't figure it out. He was looking over on the other side, and the Chinese soldiers are having a blast, and they're all cleaning themselves up, and why can't he jump in the river? And then a carpenter working at the base, a man from Korea, came up to him, and he said, today a baby was born into our family. But you see, we don't have enough food now, and we won't have enough food to feed the baby. And so the oldest member of the family will go with a blanket and a jug of water to the river and wait to die. And so we don't want you to swim in our river because our old ones are floating out to sea. And Buddy said he gave me that because he believed that there are precedents in situations of terrible despair for people to act with great generosity. And of course I've seen amongst the Afghan peace volunteers and the seamstresses the most remarkable generosity, as well as an ability to control the panic they do feel. Just so recently there was a 5-hour gun battle only 5 blocks away from the home they share, and they were frightened. They were really trembling. But they've learned to control their panic and also to, with one another, avoid succumbing to revenge and retaliation. These youngsters are living together, Hazara and Pashto and Tajik, and they come from areas where Hazaras have killed Farz's brother, and he's Tajik. And Tajiks have plundered the households of the young Hazaras, and this is in their current memory. And Abdulhai's father, Zarguna's father, Hamajan's father, killed by the Pashto. And so they have every good reason to be seething with desires for revenge and retaliation. But they've learned how to overcome that. And similarly, my friend Roz Muhammad's sister, her husband was a graduate of the police academy. They were so proud. And he was in a garden sipping tea with 4 of the other graduates, and suddenly a United States drone hovered overhead and blasted all 5, killed them. And what she told me was, believe me, I never want to see this carnage hurt another family. And so I have so much to learn. People sometimes ask me, well, why do you go over to Afghanistan, and what do you do? What keeps you going? And to all 3 questions I can say, I fall in love easily, and I get a chance to sit there and listen and learn a great deal from some very wise people. I never thought I'd have 12 teenagers being my mentors at this point in life, but it works pretty well. And I get a chance to be amongst some of the finest people in the world, and to really begin to believe that there's no reason to market warfare. I want to close by one more reference to Korea, because in Korea now, and Jeju Island, every single morning, very brave activists are gathering in classical nonviolent form, practicing Gandhian types of techniques to try still to prevent the construction of a new naval base that the Korean military and Korean government are installing. And that base is something the United States very much wants to see. That base would mean that they can install Aegis combat weapon systems. It will mean that the United States could rely on that base in the event of advanced further conflict with China. And so I look to these activists who are sending us such a good signal. And I want to pick it up. Because here we are in the United States, you know, when we ask ourselves, why are we at war in Afghanistan? Surely it has to do with controlling the pricing and the flow of resources underneath those Hindu Kush mountains where my friends go out on the donkeys to get their fuel. Lithium, rare earth elements, the kinds of resources we use in our computers and in our cell phones. Surrounding the Caspian Sea, a huge deposit of natural gas and fossil fuels. If the United States can build the pipeline, the fabled Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, then the U.S. can control the pricing and the flow of those precious and irreplaceable resources. Hillary Clinton was very excited as Secretary of State about the new Silk routes so that we could extract along the roadways that we would build, and we could control the pricing of energy that's needed by China, needed by Russia, and that gives us the leg up. And so instead of cooperating, instead of learning from the young ones who teach us about controlling panic and avoiding revenge or retaliation, instead of trying to rely on words rather than weapons, we in the United States run the risk of being viewed as the most menacing, the most terrifying country in the world. But we can turn that around. And that's what I look forward to so much. I think that as we stand together, shoulder to shoulder, catching courage from one another, we have a tremendous responsibility, but also opportunity to turn around the Asia pivot, to turn around the pivots toward continued warfare, and to say that we want to be guided by a very simple force that we all believe in and trust: love. Thank you. And I'd be very pleased for your comments, questions, ideas. Is that Jim Duncan?
That's right.
Thank you.
My question has to do with how you ended on love. And the stories about the children are remarkable. In your conversations with the children, what part does faith have to do with their resilience and their ability to cope?
So Jim's question is about what part faith has to do with the resilience and the coping ability of the young people whom I've encountered. I have to confess that my ability to speak Dari is quite limited, but I'm very fortunate to have the pretty constant accompaniment of a Singaporean MD who's quite fluent in Dari and in English, and some of the youngsters are becoming more fluent. I'm not so sure that for the young ones I know, their faith is grounded in the traditional mores that they grew up with in their families. I think their faith that I sense is in something very new and different for them that they've begun to learn from people like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Mohandas Gandhi, and Noam Chomsky. If you were to walk into their household in the courtyard, you'd see three large vinyl banners. And one shows Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, another Mohandas Gandhi, and a third the Muslim Gandhi, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. And then if you go into their library, they're so proud now, they've got 400 volumes, 200 in Dari and Pashto and about 200 in English, and I can guarantee you any of the Westerners who've gone to visit have had their duffel bags duly filled. But they've got a whole shelf devoted to Noam Chomsky. And in fact, Noam Chomsky was on the phone with them one day, And he's had a couple half-hour conversations. And the youngest amongst them, Gulamai, said, Prof. Noam, what do you think of reparations? And Noam Chomsky said, oh, now that's a very good question. And Gulamai was just beaming, you know. And he went on to say, Professor Chomsky, that any civilized country would pay reparations for the suffering caused. And he noted that it isn't just the United States, but certainly Iran and Pakistan and Russia. And in fact, you could go to the really sad museum where all of the cluster bombs and the unexploded ordnance and the different kinds of landmines that have been littered across the Afghan landscape are curated, and they come from countries all around the world. And Professor Chomsky said all of those countries should be paying reparations. And I think it's in that kind of generosity that these youngsters have their faith and their hope. And I see them then manifesting that kind of generosity, just nuts and bolts generosity, giving their space over so that the seamstresses who come in and said, I think I'm losing my mind, I think I'm going insane. And you say, what's the matter? And the question always gets the same answer. I can't feed my children. And ask, well, what do you feed the children? And then shame and guilt, stale bread and tea without sugar. And these youngsters heard that, and they started rolling up their bedrolls, hanging the curtains so that women would have privacy. Anne Wright, Colonel Anne Wright, donated enough sewing machines so that the women can come every day and do a women's cooperative to try to become seamstresses. So I think that they have a great deal of faith in simplicity, sharing, service, and generosity. And I feel sure that in their heart of hearts as they pray, and many of them are very prayerful, and they all do the Ramadan fast, and they have great respect and pride in their culture. But I think in their heart of hearts, maybe they could join me in kind of being happy over Thomas Paine's line, my country is the world, my religion is to do good. Heather, thank you.
What's your take on the Afghan elections? Because we see kind of an interesting side of it here with the media, so it's something on the ground.
So there's a question about the Afghan elections, given that the media here has given one side, and a question about what is the sense on the ground. Well, one sense on the ground in some very ordinary people whom I've encountered is that elites in Afghanistan are going to maintain control, and that they will then develop security so that their control is consistent. And that no matter who wins an election, you can count on this pattern to be maintained. The Afghan peace volunteers have said to me that they think it's a bit sad that an event that happens once every 4 to 6 years is kind of elevated into being the pinnacle of democratic decision making, and then people just kind of go into a sort of amnesia after that. So they themselves were not so excited about the elections. They also pointed out to me that every person running in the first round of major candidates was either himself or the running mate was a major warlord. And in fact, every cabinet level ministry in the current government, except for the Ministry of Agriculture, is run by a major warlord or drug lord. And so I think again about those roads that are controlled and the enormous sums of money that are made by imposing fees on every vehicle that moves. And there's just, I mean, the means for bribery and corruption are rampant. Well, is there some hope to be had that things might kind of settle down after presumably a runoff? Well, of course, we want to see that. But it's a bit of an elusive hope, because you see, it's not just the armed Taliban that are a source of great fear in a city like Kabul. There are networks of people who, since 2002, sometimes some of them on the side of the United States and then sometimes not, but almost always acquiring more and more weapons and more sophisticated weapons, there are quite a number of armed groups with large constituencies. So it's a very frightening place to live in that regard of whether or not there might be civil war in the future, and whether or not the elections can somehow cobble together a shared governance that could offset the possibility of further violence. So we all kind of are looking at the crystal ball, I suppose. Thank you.
Is it worth focusing on the people that benefit in the U.S., or is it better to just sort of set an example of caring and wanting change? I mean, like, do you look at the Carlyle Group or Lockheed Martin and maybe, I remember a long time ago, I think Lockheed Martin gave money to some guy to start a group to push to invade Iraq and donate money to start some conservative magazine, put that out. He'd been a vice president or something at Lockheed Martin too. There sometimes are direct connections between weapons companies in the U.S. that are pushing a particular war, like the Iraq War. So is it good for us to try and keep track of all those things and try and do something, write letters or shame them or something, or is it better to try and care for people who are being harmed and say there must be another way?
So the question is asking us to consider whether our time and energy is best spent in kind of unmasking some of the wrongdoings of major corporations that are war profiteers that benefit from these wars, or is it better to use our time and energy to try to protect and care for the people bearing the brunt of the war? Is that what you were wanting to ask?
I guess it's sort of obvious, but the answer.
Oh, I wish it were more obvious to me. I think both. Realtors say education. I'm sorry, location, 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 and what I'm thinking is we have to say to ourselves, education, 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 and we really do have to keep educating ourselves on how it is that major forces in our country, through their leverage, through their insistence on pushing more and more toward developing spheres of influence that won't cooperate with other spheres of influence, but rather want to keep provoking and goading arms races and new ways to be in conflict. And I'm thinking specifically right now of the United States in relation to China and in relation to Russia, and that there's great money to be made in continued warfare and in maintaining a status quo of ongoing war. And then on the other hand, what about those who suffer so egregiously? I can remember being at the bedsides of children in Iraq, which you mentioned, and a friend of mine who is a nurse, Martin Thomas, looked down that ward, a pediatrics ward, and he said, "I think I understand. It's a death row for infants, isn't it? A death row for infants." So with the urgency of children's lives in the balance, where do we put our energies? And it's difficult to find an answer to that question. But sometimes, as we remain sort of persistent and attentive, we can accomplish both. If you'll indulge me for just a moment, we used to be called Voices in the Wilderness. That was a very good name for our group. But we changed our name to Voices for Creative Nonviolence. And many people have thought, well, that's because the United States government came after you, right? Because you were criminals and you broke the economic sanctions. We never thought what we did was criminal, but we broke those sanctions every chance we could, bringing vitamins and antibiotics to children and families in Iraq. But actually, I don't really think a name change made very much of a difference, and it wasn't really, we were found guilty, and we said we would never pay the fine, but I don't think that was so much why the United States government never came after us. I think in a way, Condoleezza Rice might have saved us. Now this is speculation on my part, but Condoleezza Rice was the chair of the International Liaison Committee for Chevron, while Chevron was paying money under the table to Saddam Hussein's government before they were finally told you better cut that out because it's breaking the economic sanctions. But they broke the economic sanctions to a far greater extent than Voices ever did. And Senator Carl Levin's investigative committee was beginning to unearth the fact that when Chevron had settled up out of court, they were convicted, but they settled up for a $2.1 million fine, I think. In fact, at the time when they were paying that money for lucrative contracts, Condoleezza Rice was the person pretty much in charge, being the one who was the head of the International Liaison Department for Chevron. And I think she and quite a few others in the big oil-making money groups, there was, along with Chevron, Coastal Oil and Thor Oil, Odin Oil Company, there were quite a few others. I think they didn't want the little sanctions breakers to be so noticeable. So we had done what we believed was our mission to do, that we were to break those economic sanctions as often as we could, invoking the means of nonviolent civil disobedience. But in doing so, to also tell the truth about others who were involved in promoting warfare. And I think that one of the ways to stop a next war is to keep telling the truth about the current war, but often that truth is going to be about those who bear the brunt of the war. So keep telling the truth as best we can. And that may, if we're very, very, very fortunate, it may save some lives. And some of those lives may be the children. Thank you.
I'm wondering what you hear from Afghan people about, generally, I know there'd be differences of opinion. What are their beliefs about why the U.S. went into Afghanistan in the first place, and why we have stayed there for 13 years?
The question has been asked about why the United States went into the Afghan country in the first place, why we stayed there for 13 years, and yet not answering that question in terms of what I think, but what do people I meet in Afghanistan think. Well, of course, there are certainly many, many, many different perspectives in Afghanistan. I think, though, that it's instructive for me to recall that when I was in the Bamyan province, a very rural province of Afghanistan, in a particularly remote area, I had a chance to sit with 13 women, and we'd had a lovely meal together. There was very fine translation, and so I don't even know why, but I started to tell the women about having been in New York City on September 11th. And I started by asking them, did you ever hear about a day when large passenger planes flew into a tall building in New York City? And they were looking at me as though to say, well, she seemed like such a nice person. Why is she telling this weird story? And that's when I realized not a single woman in that room had ever heard of 9/11. So I think for people who have grown up in environs where the majority of people are illiterate, and amongst women in Afghanistan right now, 27% are literate, 6% of girls finished 1 year of schooling, no matter what the United States soldiers may be saying about how much they've done to improve the education of girls, which you often read about in the papers. It's just not true. I think often it's bewildering why foreign conquering groups want to come into their country. But I've often heard people say to me that they don't believe the United States is going to leave, because why would the United States have spent all those years and all that money? I mean, I'm not sure how many people in Afghanistan know this, but the United States has spent $2 billion per week on the war in Afghanistan. $2 billion per week. Now, what it would cost to rehabilitate the rural infrastructure might be in the vicinity of $40 billion. And that's what the people really need. They need to have the irrigation ditches cleaned and the flocks replenished and the orchards reseeded, seeding the mulberries and the pistachios and the walnuts and the apricots that they once grew. And that could maybe bring income into families. And $40 billion is an enormous sum, but it's 20 weeks of the war. Instead, it's likely that the same thing that happened with previous invading groups, the United States will remain in Afghanistan using the 21st century militarism that no longer needs large bases, they can do quite well with Joint Special Operation Commandos, drone surveillance, drone weaponized aircraft, and combat brigade unit helicopters, and then soldiers that they would train. I'll just mention that Blackwater, a company many of you would be familiar with, now is in Afghanistan, renamed as Academy, Academi, and they've been working on construction of a huge base just outside of Kabul called Camp Integrity, so that these former Blackwater mercenaries can teach the Afghans how to do night raids and interrogation and cart people off for imprisonment. So I think there's a certain cynicism that is valid amongst people. The media is very controlled by the United States. The United States has, through USAID, managed to gain control over most of the radio stations all across the country. And in terms of print media, there isn't a wide expanse of opinion. And of course, it's also difficult for people to speak up because there are so many armed warlords who might disagree with them. Thank you.
So, in regard to the agricultural, I know during the war with Russia that part of the agenda was they wiped out a lot of the orchards, apricots, almonds, pomegranate grapes. So, and then I've understood that there's an effort to replant a lot of those orchards in rural areas. So have you been exposed to any of that effort? And also I've read some reports on heroin use within Afghanistan, that it has gone way up. So do you have any exposure? Have you had any exposure to that as well?
Well, thank you. Both a comment and a question has been presented to us that there certainly has, since the time of the Soviets, been a terrible destruction of the orchards. I believe the Soviet Union often destroyed those orchards because they wanted to have better vision in order to attack people. There has been some effort to replenish the orchards, and then also a concern because of the rise of heroin usage within Afghanistan. With regard to the reseeding of the orchards, I was so fortunate over my first years in going to Afghanistan from 2010 until 2013 to be someone who was befriended by Nur Aga Akbari. And he worked with the Ministry of Agriculture, but he was an agronomist. He had gone over to Oxford in the UK, and he learned organic farming there. But when the Soviets were imprisoning his brothers, and then he found that all of his brothers had either been disappeared or killed, he came back and he tried to get all of his brothers' children to safety, and then he eventually came back and he started his own family. And he was so proud of what he knew in terms of agronomy, and he was trying to start a large terraced farming project in Panjshir, and he invited us to come and visit there, and also to get the proper implements and tools to other farmers. And I suspect that often farmers who've begun to plant opium have a hard time. It's hard to wean a group of farming people off of planting the opium, because who else is going to say, well, we'll give you the seeds and we'll take your product to market and we'll make it worth your while to plant the opium, and you'll be really on your own if you decide you're going to plant something else. So I know that he was involved in helping to do that. And then Nasrin Khan, who herself was killed at the Taverna du Liban very recently, working with the UN, sent me an email. I'm so sorry. Nur Aga Akbari, the father of 7 children, has been killed as he was coming back from his work as a Ministry of Agriculture employee. He was shot down in cold blood after visiting farmers. So it's very, very, very hard in Afghanistan to do the right thing in terms of how you cultivate the land, what you want to harvest. I'm so impressed by a woman named Madame Haidari. She made a film about people living under the bridge who were addicted to opium. And after she finished her film, she just couldn't leave the people who were living under the bridge. It's called Pule Sorg, very near the neighborhood we live in Kabul. So she opened up a restaurant. And she said, after she helped these guys go through a recovery program, you're all on my dole now. I'll pay you to help me keep this restaurant going. and it's going very, very well, and she's got a place for recovery. And you see people really trying to regain their lives. But of course, with 93% of the world's opium coming from Afghanistan, with some mothers who are just trying to make a living by weaving rugs, and they've got to fill their quota, and how can they do it if the children are crying? So they give the children opium. With so many people who can't get medicines. I mean, I know a family where one of the sons, his body was so mangled by a drone attack, and the family doesn't have any money for medicine, so they've given him opium, and he was in tremendous withdrawal when I had last visited. I mean, it's a huge problem, and likely to become even more of a nightmare. And this is the kind of thing that the drones, which are supposedly gaining intelligence to help establish patterns of life in Afghanistan, the drones will never tell us what we need to understand about patterns of life in Afghanistan, where people are coping with despair and brutality and hopelessness. And they'll never understand, through drone surveillance, the courage of young people and seamstresses who say together to one another, we're going to find hope together, and we're not going to give up. And we're even going to befriend these Westerners who come over here. And they're going to come into our home, and we'll give them our warm blankets and teach them how to light a fire. Thank you for your question. Thank you, Ron.
If I could switch topics to Iraq, and the United States withdrew troops from Iraq, and we're finished with Iraq, and we left and we declared victory or whatever. Do we have any responsibility for what goes on in Iraq today?
The question is, now that the United States has withdrawn troops from Iraq and we've declared victory in Iraq, do we have any responsibility for what's going on in Iraq today? I think unquestionably the United States must learn to say two words: we're sorry. We're so very sorry for all of the lives that were snuffed out. We're sorry that President Obama could get up in front of the United States and say that you can't compare what happened in Iraq to the Russian invasion of Crimea or to policies with regard to the Ukraine, because the United States didn't take Iraq's resources, because the United States didn't take Iraq's land. Well, all right, let's not argue those two things, but over 500,000 children aren't the resource of a country? 500,000 children punished to death, dying from starvation. It really means death by asphyxiation. Might we not apologize that we insisted that those economic sanctions, while it was clear as day they weren't depriving Saddam Hussein of a single meal, brutally and lethally punished children who had committed no crime. And then it was as though we said, we had initially to starve you so we could stop bombing you, and then we had to bomb you so we could stop starving you. What kind of a country do we want to be perceived in the eyes of other people all around the world? Do we think that we're enhancing our safety when we act in brutish and murderous ways and so dispense with the lives of children? And even General McChrystal said in January of 2013 that the arrogance of our means of warfare is jeopardizing the security of people in the United States. If we want security, we must extend the hand of friendship to other people. We must extend our capacity to share resources, and we must recognize the very real terrors that afflict us all. The terror of what we're doing to our own environment, the terror of what we're doing to our air, to our ground, to our water, the depletion of the resources, the overconsumption, and the patterns of our life which are so unsustainable. And we love the grandchildren. Did you notice that? People all across this country love their grandchildren. Parents love their children. Do you know, Wilfred Owen comes to mind for me when I think about Iraq. Anytime you went to the University of Baghdad, to the literature department, it was so amazing. The graduate students in literature were studying Wilfred Owen. And I thought, oh, wait a minute. How can this be that under Saddam Hussein's government, where they're constantly doing oversight on the studies and the curriculum. Wilfred Owens was a squeaker, and his poetry, his incredibly pacifistic and brave poetry written from the trenches of World War I, those lines that decry warfare anywhere. How did Wilfred Owen become the most studied, prized poet in the graduate schools of literature in Kabul University? Well, I think I finally might have a clue. Siegfried Sassoon was one of Wilfred Owen's best friends. And Siegfried Sassoon grew up in Baghdad. So Wilfred Owen's lines. He wrote about Father Abraham binding the son Isaac. And when the young man had first bought all the wood together to form the funeral pyre, he bound Isaac. And he was about to plunge a dagger into Isaac before he burned the corpse of his own beloved son, believing this is what the God wants. And Wilfred Owen writes, "The angel of the Lord said, 'Lay not thy hand upon the lad. See in the thicket a ram. Offer the ram of pride instead.' And the old man would not sow, and slew the son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one." And so I asked myself, what is the ram of pride? See in the thicket a ram. Offer the ram of pride instead. And my friends, I'm not sure, but I think our collective pride, not only that we're the city on the hill, that we're the beacon to the rest of the world, but we take care of the children. We're the protectors of the children. We love the children. Maybe our pride is somewhat misplaced because we export more weapons, we sell, and we store, and we've used more weapons of mass destruction than any other country on earth or in history. I was fortunate to be my dad's full-time caregiver for the last 8 years of his life. You know, an old person wakes up in the middle of the night, and it's a good idea to come running, right? And he'd call for me, "Kath, Kath," and I'd go, and "What's the matter, Dad? What's wrong?" And most often, he'd be remembering something that was wrong. He'd say, "It's not right. Those kids over there in Haiti, they shouldn't have to starve." Or, "It's not right. Those children in Iraq, they didn't have to die." And then one night, toward the very end of his life, he called for me, and I asked, "What's wrong?" And he had his head in his hands, and he said, "This World War II veteran, we shouldn't have bombed Hiroshima. We shouldn't have bombed Nagasaki." And there we were, two frail people sitting on a bedside with more questions than answers. And so I say to you, I still have more questions than answers, but I do want collectively to see what that ram of pride might be that we could set aside and really carve out a new way forward that's no longer characterized on placing our security in threat and force and weapons, but rather what we know works, because it's worked all throughout our lives. Simplicity and service and sharing. And I guess we should add one thing. Make sure that the neediest are our number one priority. And believe nonviolence can change the world. Thank you.